Our next argument for God's existence is the ontological argument. The ontological argument differs from the teleological argument in that the teleological argument, both forms, use experience as evidence of at least one of their premises. We have experience of people designing watches. We have experience of complexity in the universe. But the ontological argument is different. First offered by St. Anselm, the ontological argument is an argument about the existence of God given the definition of God. Ontology in philosophy is existence. So our ontological argument is going to argue that given what something has to be God, it must exist. So let's take a look at it. God, by definition, is the greatest being possible. Suppose the greatest being possible exists only in the understanding, in the mind as a mental object. Then a greater being than the greatest being possible can be conceived, one existing not just in the understanding, but also in reality. For a being is greater if it exists in reality than if it exists only in the understanding. But this yields a contradiction, for a being greater than the greatest being possible is impossible. Therefore, God, the greatest being possible, must exist in reality, not just in the understanding. So there's a lot going on in this argument, okay? This argument uses only reason. We don't rely on experience in any way whatsoever. So let's take a look at it. First, premise 1, God by definition is the greatest being possible. We can understand this without too much difficulty, right? In order for something to be God, it has to be supreme and perfect. And that means there's nothing better that could possibly be than God. All right, premise 2 begins what we call our reductio ad absurdum. Okay, reductio ad absurdum. What this means is I'm going to assume, for the sake of argument, that my opponent is correct, and I'm going to discover that a contradiction is true as a result. This should be sounding familiar. Remember our Socratic method. So Anselm says, I'm going to presume, for the sake of argument, that the atheist is correct. The greatest being possible exists only in the understanding. This is the atheist notion of God. The atheist can't deny that God exists in the understanding, because if they didn't have an idea of God, they couldn't claim God does not exist. The atheist simply denies that God exists in the world. Okay, premise 3 does a whole lot, so try and keep up. Let's start with the parenthetical. I'm going to use different colors here. For a being is greater if it exists in reality than if it exists only in the understanding. This is the idea that existence is a great making quality. Existence is a great making quality. What that means is, if you've got an idea of something and that idea is pretty spectacular, if that idea existed in reality, it would be even better than the idea. Okay? So it's not that everything that exists is great or perfect. It's just that things that exist are better than the mere idea of that thing. Does that make sense? Things that exist are greater than the mere idea of those things. Okay? The mere idea of an iPad is not as great as the actual iPad. The mere idea of the Galaxy 7 is not as great as the actual Galaxy 7. You know, the Samsung phones. I wanted to have an Apple and an Android example for you. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so that's the first part of premise 3. Then a greater being than the greatest being possible can be conceived, one existing not just in the understanding, but also in reality. What's going on here is that first and foremost, I'm conceiving of something just like the atheist God that exists in reality as well. Okay? If the atheist is right and God exists in the understanding alone, well, I can conceive, I can tell myself a story of something just like that thing, but that exists in reality. Well, when I do that, I am conceiving of a greater being than the greatest being possible. Okay, existence is a great making quality. If I can tell myself a story about God, the atheist God, that also exists in reality, then I am telling myself a story about something greater than the atheist God, which is supposed to be the greatest being possible. Okay? Premise 3 relies on this idea that if I can imagine it, then logically it's possible. Okay, so, and remember Descartes' conceivability argument. I can conceive of my existing without a body. It's not that I do exist without a body, but I can imagine it. Okay, so I can imagine the greatest being possible existing, but being even better because it exists. But this yields a contradiction, for a being greater than the greatest being possible is impossible. Therefore, God, the greatest being possible, must exist in reality, not just in the understanding. Does that make sense? Did it elucidate it for y'all a little bit? I know that this is a complicated argument. All right, I'm going to try one more thing that history has told me helps. I'm going to tell y'all a story. I'm going to tell y'all a story about Alpha. Alpha is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and morally perfect. Okay? Omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and morally perfect. Sound familiar? Okay, now I'm going to tell you a story about Beta. Beta is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and morally perfect. Okay, which one's better, Alpha or Beta? Hold on. There's something wrong. I'm looking at these. Oh, shucks. I forgot. Beta exists. Which one's better? Beta, right? All right, so go back to the argument. God, by definition, is the greatest being possible. Suppose the greatest being possible exists only in the understanding. In other words, suppose the greatest being possible is alpha. Okay, suppose alpha is the greatest being possible. Well, I can tell myself a story about beta. Existence is a great making quality, so beta is better than alpha. So I am conceiving, I'm telling myself a story of a greater being than the greatest being possible. In other words, I'm telling myself a story about beta, which is better than alpha, which was supposed to be the greatest being possible. But conceiving of a being greater than the greatest being possible is in fact impossible. That's a contradiction. So the greatest being possible must be beta. Beta exists, so God must exist. Okay? The atheist God is alpha, but I can tell myself a story about beta. Beta's the greater being. God has to be the greater being. So God must be beta. Beta exists in reality. So God exists. Does that help? It's a tricky argument. And on the one hand, I want to make sure you understand what's being said. I want to make sure you understand what the argument is saying. Whether you agree with it is a different story. Okay? So if you need to, listen to all of that again.